There is a kind of holiness that does not announce itself. It does not shine in public. It does not receive applause, and most people abandon it very early because it costs more than they expected. Let me ask you something quietly, honestly. What happens when God asks you to grow, but no one notices? When your effort is real, your sacrifice is sincere, yet your life looks unchanged from the outside. This is where many souls stop. We are taught, often without realizing it, to associate holiness with visibility, with recognition, with results others can see. And when growth happens in silence, without confirmation, without reward, doubt begins to whisper, "Is this even worth it?" Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood this tension deeply. Her path toward God was not marked by extraordinary missions or public recognition. It was shaped by something far more demanding, faithfulness in obscurity. And that is precisely why her way is so difficult to sustain. Silence exposes us. It removes the comfort of approval. It strips away the reassurance that we are doing well. When holiness unfolds quietly, the soul must rely on God alone, not on feelings, not on feedback, not on progress that can be measured, only on trust. This is the hidden cost few are prepared for. Many begin the journey with enthusiasm. They are willing to pray more, to change habits, to surrender distractions. But when the interior work brings no visible transformation, when struggles remain, when emotions feel dry, when life does not suddenly improve, discouragement settles in. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they give up. Not because they don't love God, but because they expected holiness to feel different. Saint Thérèse teaches something uncomfortable here. Real spiritual growth often feels like nothing is happening. In fact, the deeper the work God is doing, the quieter it becomes. Grace does not always rush. Sometimes it burrows. Sometimes it hides. There is a particular suffering in offering God fidelity without feedback, loving Him when prayer feels empty, choosing patience when no one sees the effort, remaining gentle when your interior feels exhausted. This is not spiritual failure. This is purification. The soul learns to love God for who He is, not for what He gives. And that transition is costly. It demands letting go of the need to feel holy, successful, or spiritually strong. Most give up at this stage because silence feels like abandonment. But Thérèse would say otherwise. She believed that God does His most intimate work in the places where the soul feels smallest, weakest, and unseen, not to discourage, but to teach total trust, to teach love without conditions. Holiness in silence is not passive. It is active surrender. It is choosing faith without emotional reinforcement. It is continuing to offer small acts of love when nothing inside you responds. And yes, this path is costly, because it requires staying, when quitting would be easier. There is a moment on the silent path where the soul begins to question itself, not loudly but persistently. It is not a dramatic crisis, it is quieter than that. It feels like a slow erosion of confidence, a subtle wondering. Am I actually moving forward, or am I standing still? This is the stage Saint Thérèse knew intimately. When holiness unfolds without external signs, the soul loses the usual markers of progress. There is no applause, no sudden peace, no sense of spiritual elevation. And because human nature longs for reassurance, the absence of these signs can feel like failure. But Thérèse understood something most souls resist accepting. God often removes visible comfort not to punish, but to deepen love. In silence, the soul is no longer supported by emotion. Prayer becomes an act of will rather than feeling. Love becomes a decision rather than a response. Faith is no longer fueled by sweetness, but by trust alone. This is where holiness stops being attractive and starts becoming real. The temptation at this stage is subtle. It does not come as open rebellion. It comes as weariness, as spiritual fatigue, as the thought, maybe this effort doesn't matter as much as I thought. And this is where most give up. They do not abandon God outright. They simply loosen their grip. They pray less attentively. They surrender less fully. They begin to protect themselves from disappointment. Slowly, devotion becomes cautious. Saint Thérèse would call this the danger of measured love. She believed that God desires not a love that calculates results, but a love that persists without proof. In her spiritual vision, the value of an act was never determined by how it felt or how visible it was, but by how completely it was offered. Silence tests intention. When no one sees your patience, why remain patient? When prayer gives no consolation, why continue praying? When effort produces no sense of progress, why persist? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are invitations. They reveal whether the soul is seeking God or the experience of God. Thérèse chose the former, even when it cost her interior comfort. She accepted dryness. She embraced smallness. She allowed herself to feel ineffective, unremarkable, even spiritually poor, because she trusted that love offered in darkness was not wasted. This is difficult for modern souls. We live in a world that values evidence, metrics, outcomes. Silence feels unproductive. Hidden fidelity feels inefficient. But the spiritual life does not follow visible logic. Holiness grows underground before it ever bears fruit. And the soul that stays in silence without demanding reassurance undergoes a quiet transformation. Pride softens. Dependence shifts. The heart becomes less focused on self and more anchored in God's presence, even when that presence feels distant. This is not stagnation. This is depth. But it requires endurance, and endurance is costly. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux did not discover holiness by escaping weakness. She discovered it by entering it fully, without resistance, without disguise, and without demand for recognition. What she called her little way was not a strategy to feel better spiritually. It was a choice to love God exactly where she was smallest. And this is where silence becomes essential. The little way only works in hidden places. It cannot survive where the soul depends on admiration, affirmation, or visible success. It is built on ordinary moments that appear insignificant, moments no one celebrates and few even notice. Thérèse believed that God does not wait for great actions. He waits for availability, for consent, for love offered without spectacle. Silence strips holiness down to its purest form. In silence, the soul cannot perform. It cannot impress. It cannot hide behind intensity. All that remains is intention. This is why becoming holy in silence is so costly. It confronts the deepest instinct of the human heart, the desire to matter in ways others can see. When God invites the soul into a hidden path, He is not diminishing its value, He is refining its love. The little way asks something radical: to believe that a small act done with complete love has eternal weight, even if it feels empty, repetitive, or unseen. It asks the soul to trust that God measures differently than the world does. Thérèse once expressed in the essence of her spirituality that she wanted to love Jesus even when she could not feel that love herself. This is not emotional repression. It is spiritual maturity. Loving God without emotional reward is not hypocrisy. It is freedom. Most souls want to feel holy before they believe they are growing. Thérèse reversed that logic. She believed that growth often begins where feeling ends, that faith becomes strongest when it is no longer supported by sensation. This is why so many abandon the silent path. It offers no immediate reassurance, no dramatic confirmation, no sense of spiritual achievement, only the quiet knowledge that love is being given. Without proof, it is received. But Thérèse trusted God's heart more than her own perception. She understood that silence does not mean absence, that dryness does not mean rejection, that smallness does not mean insignificance. On the contrary, these are often signs that God is working at a level deeper than emotion. The little way requires the soul to stop asking, "Am I progressing?" and begin asking, "Am I offering myself?" This shift is subtle, but decisive, because the soul that continues loving in silence stops depending on self-evaluation. It learns to rest in God's gaze rather than its own judgment, and in doing so, it becomes lighter, freer, and more honest. Holiness in this way stops being a performance. It becomes a relationship. And relationships, when real, grow quietly. There is a reason this silent path feels especially difficult today. Modern life conditions the soul to expect immediacy. Results should be visible. Effort should be validated. Progress should be measurable. And when spiritual growth refuses to follow this logic, Frustration quietly takes over. Silence clashes with our instincts. You pray, yet your thoughts remain scattered. You try to be patient, yet irritation still rises. You seek God sincerely, yet he feels distant. In a world obsessed with productivity, this feels like inefficiency, like failure. Saint Thérèse would recognize this struggle immediately. She knew that the greatest danger in the spiritual life is not weakness. It is discouragement disguised as realism. The belief that this isn't working often has less to do with God's absence and more to do with unmet expectations. We expect transformation to feel dramatic. God often makes it imperceptible. Silence dismantles the illusion that holiness should be emotionally satisfying. It forces the soul to confront a difficult truth. Faith is not sustained by feeling understood, comforted, or spiritually accomplished. It is sustained by trust in God's faithfulness, even when nothing internally confirms it. This is where many modern souls retreat, not because they reject God, but because they cannot tolerate interior uncertainty. They want clarity, assurance, emotional reinforcement. And when silence offers none of these, they interpret it as spiritual stagnation. But Thérèse saw silence differently. She understood that God sometimes withholds consolation to heal attachment, to gently detach the soul from spiritual self-focus, to teach it to love him without negotiating conditions. This is profoundly countercultural. The silent path demands that the soul stop checking itself constantly. Am I doing enough? Am I feeling enough? Am I changing fast enough? These questions, while understandable, keep the soul turned inward. Silence turns it outward, toward God alone. And this turning feels uncomfortable because it removes control. It asks the soul to trust that God sees growth long before the soul does, that unseen fidelity is not wasted, that hidden perseverance is not ignored. Many give up here because the cost feels too high. To continue without reassurance feels risky, vulnerable, almost foolish. But Thérèse would say that this is precisely where love becomes pure. To remain faithful when prayer feels dry is not spiritual stubbornness. It is humility. To continue choosing patience when no one notices is not weakness. It is strength refined by love. To stay present with God when he feels silent is not naivete. It is courage. Silence is not empty. It is demanding. And the demand is this: will you trust me without proof? Those who stay discover something quietly transformative. The soul stops striving to feel holy and begins to rest in being loved. Anxiety softens. Comparison fades. The need to perform dissolves. Holiness slowly becomes simpler, but only for those who do not leave early. There comes a stage on this quiet path where the soul realizes something unsettling. Silence is no longer temporary. It is not a passing season. It becomes a place of dwelling, and this realization forces a decision. Will I stay, even if this does not change? This is where holiness in silence demands its highest price. Up to this point, many souls endure dryness, hoping it will eventually give way to consolation. They accept obscurity, believing recognition will come later, if not from others, then at least from themselves. But Saint Thérèse's path goes further. It asks the soul to surrender even the hope of feeling spiritually successful. This surrender is frightening, because hope for visible progress is often the last thing holding the soul steady. When that hope is removed, what remains is pure intention, stripped of ambition, stripped of expectation, stripped of spiritual self-interest, and most are not prepared for that level of poverty. Silence reveals what the soul is truly seeking, not through accusation but through exposure. It shows whether prayer is sustained by love or by outcome, whether faith is rooted in God himself or in the comfort he provides. Thérèse chose to remain even when nothing affirmed her choice. She did not measure holiness by interior satisfaction. She measured it by fidelity, by whether love continued to be offered, even when it felt weak, repetitive, or unnoticed. This kind of perseverance changes the soul slowly, almost invisibly. The desire to impress fades, the urge to compare weakens, the fear of being insignificant loosens its grip. The soul begins to live less for evaluation and more for presence. This is costly because it dismantles identity. The identity built on being devout, strong, or faithful must give way to something humbler, being small, dependent, and receptive. The soul stops trying to prove its love and starts allowing itself to be loved. Ironically, this is when true freedom begins, but many never reach this point. Not because they are incapable, but because they leave when silence stops offering reassurance. They return to safer ground, to visible efforts, to spiritual activity that feels productive. Saint Thérèse would say they left just before the deepest work began, the work that purifies love from self-protection, the work that teaches the soul to trust without controlling, the work that allows God to act without interference. Holiness in silence is not passive resignation, it is active consent. A repeated yes offered without evidence that it matters, and yet it matters profoundly. Because God does not overlook hidden faithfulness, He treasures it, He builds upon it, He uses it to shape a heart capable of loving without condition. This is the quiet victory few speak about, the victory of staying. If you have remained this far, internally, not just listening, then you already understand something most never reach. Holiness in silence is not about endurance alone. It is about transformation that happens without announcement. By this stage, the soul no longer asks when consolation will return. It no longer demands clarity. It no longer measures itself constantly. Something quieter has taken root, trust without conditions. This is the fruit of staying. Saint Thérèse believed that God delights in souls who continue loving Him when they feel incapable of loving well, not because their love is perfect, but because it is honest, stripped of illusion, free of performance. At this point, holiness becomes lighter. The soul no longer strives to feel strong. It no longer fears feeling weak. It simply remains. Silence, once threatening, becomes familiar, not comfortable, but inhabitable. The soul learns that God's presence is not proven by sensation. It is known by fidelity, and fidelity, offered quietly, carries immense weight. This is where peace begins, not the emotional kind, but the deep, settled peace of belonging. The soul stops wondering whether it is progressing and begins resting in being held. Most never reach this because they leave too early. They leave when silence feels confusing. They leave when effort feels unrewarded. They leave when holiness stops being emotionally affirming. But those who remain discover something profound. God was closest when He felt most silent, not to test the soul, but to draw it out of itself. Holiness in silence teaches the soul to live without grasping, to love without conditions, to trust without reassurance. And this kind of love, quiet, hidden, persevering, is precious beyond measure. If you feel unseen in your spiritual effort, if your prayer feels dry but sincere, if your love feels small but faithful, you are not failing. You are standing exactly where deep holiness is formed. Saint Thérèse would not urge you to do more. She would gently invite you to remain, to keep offering what feels insignificant, to trust that God sees what no one else can. Because in the kingdom of God, silence is not empty. It is sacred ground, and holiness that grows there lasts.